At this point, I turn it over to the Service Council
Thank
to,
you, Your Honor.
thank you. Mr. Spiegelhalter?
Yes, Your Honor. I just want to touch very briefly on what I would submit are some of the most important considerations in this case, and starting first with credibility. She testified that her uncle, every Sunday, this uncle with whom she lived, went and attended meetings of the UFR, and yet she could not testify as to the time of day that he did that. She did not know what happened. She did not know what he did. She did not know who else was there. She also testified that she did not know that the documents that she carried with her were forged, and yet being 16 years old and traveling with documents that may or may not have false information, and which she knows that she did not obtain on her own, call this kind of testimony into question. She put all of her faith in a man named Tonton, but did not know his last name and could not testify about it. She could not testify the number of soldiers that came to her school. She could not testify whether they were the same or they were different. Stated simply, her credibility, we submit, must be called into question. It is not enough to carry her burden of proof. The proof of the torture. We heard from an expert who talked about PTSD, but I note that there are literally, it appears to be hundreds of combinations of symptoms that one could exhibit. Our respondent here did not exhibit classic symptoms. She did exhibit other symptoms, and yet it was the same. She had PTSD. Her affect could have been excitable. Her affect could have been no affect whatsoever, and yet either way it was going to turn out to be PTSD. She didn't cry during meetings with her psychologist, and yet she cried almost as if on command in this court. All of these call into question whether PTSD is really a solid basis for determining that there had been past torture. And I also note that in some of the materials that the respondent submitted, they said that there had been a pelvic exam, and yet that had turned up no evidence of a sexual assault. Now, to touch basically on the four bases which are claimed here, at least in principle, she nearly abandoned on the stand political opinion as a basis for her claim on asylum. She said that it was her relation to her uncle and her ethnicity that were the bases for her asylum claim, and that was in direct answer to a question that Your Honor posed to her. And it was a good thing she did. From the testimony that we have and from the documents we have, there's no reason to believe that the government would have been aware that she was active in any kind of dissident organization, and even more pointedly, whether what she did could be called active, even if the government were aware of it. She did not speak in public. She attended a few speeches. She was not particularly active. She certainly was not active on the level of other people that she testified about. And again, asking for her uncle, the fact that the guards asked for her uncle repeatedly is not evidence that she had a political opinion. They never stated anything directly to her about her political opinion. Instead, they beat her, allegedly, and asked her where her uncle was. Ethnicity as a basis for her claim. I asked her on cross-examination whether the people around her were Malinke. She testified that they were not taken, they were not beaten, they were not raped. Using ethnic slurs, I submit, is simply not enough. While reprehensible, it does not mean that she was seized and that she was beaten, and certainly not that she was raped because she was of that particular origin. I do not doubt that some people within that country might detest other ethnicities, but again, that was not the reason she was taken. That was not the reason she was beaten or raped, allegedly. With regard to social group, I submit that the case law on this point would not extend to calling her distant cousin, who she calls uncle or father in different instances, as a part of her nuclear family. The cases on this point, Geber Michael and Aguirre Cervantes, do not support extending this to someone that is not her nuclear family. She could have lived anywhere. She could have lived elsewhere. She didn't have to live with her distant cousin, who the government sought. And there was no evidence that, although she surmises that because she can't get a hold of some of her family, although I note she can get a hold of her mother, that maybe they are after the social group that is constituted by her nuclear family, but her mother appears to be out of prison or somewhat safe in that she can talk on the phone to someone in the United States, or she can at least be contacted. And also I note in her affidavit that she stated that the younger children that were at the home when the guards came and seized her to ask the first time where her father was, where her uncle was, were not taken. So members of this alleged social group that have been persecuted are in fact left alone. And the differentiation that was there was that those younger members would not know where her uncle was. So the issue was, were they coming to get her because they wanted to know where her uncle was, a man who actually was active allegedly in this organization, or were they after the social group? I submit that the evidence shows that it was not the social group. It was the location of her uncle. And being persecuted in order to find out the location of one's uncle is not a recognized ground for asylum. She could have relocated. She testified that she could not get a government document where she was, and yet only had to drive 40 kilometers away. And she could go to a government building, talk to government officials, talk to government employees, and get a government document that would allow her to travel outside of the country. If this country is allegedly unified, then it shows one of two things. Either she could drive 40 miles away and live, if she weren't living with her uncle, and she would have this name, this Malinke name, that is apparently common to many people. There's no reason to believe that these government officials who were so unfamiliar with her that they would not refuse her a document or report her back to headquarters would know that she was related to this uncle if the social group is the basis. Or maybe what it actually means is it's not the government that is persecuting her if she's being persecuted in actuality, but it is soldiers who are out for their own personal gratification, who have singled out a young lady who, whatever reason it may be, but what it does mean is that she could be elsewhere in the country, or that the government is not in control of all segments if it really is the presidential guards that are after her. To raise another issue, it could be a valid government investigation of her uncle, that she has been seized and they're asking where she was. She testified that she doesn't know what he does on behalf of this dissident organization, and what she did testify is that someone with whom her uncle...
Let me stop you there, counsel.
Okay.
You're saying that the government arresting her and pulling her out from school, if that's true, would be a valid government investigation when they were seeking out her uncle?
It is a possibility that at some point it became ultra-virus. There's no doubt about that. If there was a rape, that's not acceptable. But it is possible that they took members of the family. What I'm saying is, if they came and arrested members of the family, wherever it might be, to ask them questions about where her uncle was, that could be part of a valid investigation. And indeed, what we do know is that the uncle consorted with a man who was able to give her forged documents.
But you're not seriously arguing that the government actions in this case were a valid government investigation?
No, not once they went past. I would submit that perhaps the first arrest, investigative arrest under their laws, could be a perfectly valid exercise of their police powers.
Okay.
And then finally, I would also submit that there is another reason that's highly likely for why she would relocate to the United States, and that is that, as she testifies and as other people testify, life in Guinea is rough, regardless of whether you've been singled out or not. She has relatives that have come to the United States before to seek a better education and a life that is easier, and she testified that if she were allowed to stay in the United States, that's exactly what she planned to do. And then finally, I submit that a discretionary denial for her use of forged documents is appropriate.
Okay. Thank you, counsel.